Yabba dabba doo! Hey, does anyone know if Niche is left for the day? I wanted to give him these TPS reports before he...
Aren't you worried you're gonna get in trouble for that? That's technically assault.
Look, it's gonna turn out just fine, okay? Just you wait and see.
So apparently assault's a bad thing, and because of it, I'm out of a job now.
Released in 1994 for the Super Nintendo, the Flintstones, The Treasure of Sierra Madrock is a side-scrolling platformer based on the popular Hanna-Barbera animated series. The game follows Fred and Barney on an adventure to find the lost treasure of the Sierra Madrock after the Grand Poobah of the exclusive society the Water Buffaloes announces his retirement and promises his place of office to whomever can retrieve it. Developed by Taito, the game came out at around the same time as the first live-action Flintstones movie, which is a movie I've always had a bit of a soft spot for. Back in the 90s, the game got some fairly mixed reviews, with the recorded reviews for it over on Moby Games averaging a 70% score.
In fact, the German magazine ASM, who I affectionately ribbed back in my Decap Attack video, said it best when they said that
Mehr Spaß bringt das Spiel im Zweispieler-Modus, ansonsten hebt es sich nicht über den Jump-and-Run-Durchschnitt hinaus.
which roughly translates to,
The game is more fun in the two-player mode. Otherwise, it does not stand out above the jump-and-run average.
okay.
The general consensus among critics at the time was that the game was simply too easy and short for its own good, with the game length that's about 2 or so hours long. But does it hold up? Because while critics called it average back in the day, that doesn't necessarily mean that it isn't worth revisiting. In fact, clicking through the comments section on some of the existing videos for the game over on YouTube shows that some folks really look back on this game quite fondly. And the reason I'm even doing this review to begin with is because one of my more active subscribers, Jelly God, suggested that I check it out for a video someday.
So the game clearly has its fans, even if they're just fans because of nostalgia, out of an actual enjoyment for the game itself, or out of loyalty to the Flintstones brand. Which I'm hoping will make for a fairly interesting review, because I don't know about you guys, but I don't have that much of an attachment to the Flintstones.
And don't get me wrong, I like the Flintstones. I grew up with their TV show, I'm one of the few people who likes the 2 live-action movies despite their not being all that great, and I especially enjoyed eating them alive every day in the form of Flintstones gummy vitamins. Yet, I can't really say I'm that attached to them. Because I was raised well past the series' prime in the 1960s, they just kinda exist for me. However, I do enjoy a good platformer, so I am actually pretty excited to play through this one and see how it fares.
Before we continue though, a quick question of the day. What's a game that you have a lot of nostalgia for that you'd love to replay one of these days? For me, the list is practically endless. I could always go for creating a new account in a game like RuneScape to level up, or just playing through Sonic Generations for the millionth time, because I kinda just tend to gravitate towards games from my childhood to decompress after a long day to begin with. However, a game that I've been feeling especially nostalgic for lately happens to be Halo Reach. I have a ton of fond memories of playing through the game for the first time back in 2010, and of introducing my girlfriend to it last winter when we went through the campaign in co-op together. In fact, we recently started another playthrough of Halo Reach, and while we were playing it, I even got nostalgic about the conversations I remembered having with her when we got to certain areas in the story. And I totally love that. I love the fact that fictitious areas in a video game can actually trigger real-life memories for me, and I'm curious what else comes up while we continue to play through that game's story. Be sure to leave your answer to the question of the day down in the comments. I'd love to hear your answer. And on top of that, if you're new to the channel and like what you see so far, please just feel free to subscribe or something so that you can see what else I come up with in the future. And with that out of the way, on with the video.
The Flintstones, The Treasure of Sierra Madrock takes place across several worlds that are comprised of platforming stages, boss encounters, bonus minigames, and Mode 7 races that can be navigated to and selected via the game's world map. In a lot of ways, Treasure of Sierra Madrock lifts a couple of ideas from the Super Mario series and combines them in an attempt to breathe new life to that series' formula. For example, the level designs of the game's platforming stages are relatively grid-like and pretty explicitly reminiscent of the level designs found in something like Super Mario World. to the point of even being somewhat cursed in how appropriate that game's music and sound effects feel over this one's gameplay. The same could also be said about this game's world map, which functions somewhat similarly to the ones found in Super Mario Bros. 3. Oh, and the racing stages just have Super Mario Kart written all over it.
They're the same picture.
While some may find this a bit derivative on the part of the developers, they actually do shake things up a bit in the form of the minigames themselves, the fact that the racing stages are built into the game and are not a spin-off, and the fact that these platforming stages are significantly shorter than the levels found in one of Nintendo's premier titles.
Plus, I honestly don't think it's even that bad to begin with when devs or creators of any kind for that matter wear their influences on their sleeve. I personally think it's really cool when you can tell what inspired somebody, because it invites you to read between the lines and study that influence if you so choose.
And again, things are different here. For example, I mentioned that the game uses an overworld map that's somewhat similar to the one found in Super Mario 3, which it does. But it also plays with the ideas found in that game's world map and manages to do some really interesting things in the process. In Treasure of Sierra Madrock, you need to roll a rock that'll tell you how many spaces you're able to move before you can go anywhere. And because of this, you can actually skip entire chunks of each world if you know where you're going and manage to get a little lucky. On top of that, the single player mode has you alternating between playing as Fred and Barney respectively after each level, which means you can essentially divide and conquer each world if you so please. Another one of the defining characteristics of the world map from Super Mario 3 for me, the fact that you can run into Hammer Bros that are roaming the map, also has an interesting composite in this game in the form of your wives. Basically, Fred and Barney's wives, Wilma and Betty respectively, are constantly roaming the map in search of their husbands. And if they manage to catch them, you're dragged away from your current position on the map and might end up having to backtrack for a few turns. In all honesty, it's actually a pretty great mechanic that makes navigating the world map sometimes feel like a game of cat and mouse. Though it is kinda weird to have them act as opposition towards Fred and Barney. Like, while it makes some narrative sense for them to be a little jilted towards their husbands over the fact that they've run off on an adventure without so much as a note left on the fridge, I can't help but feel like it's doing little else than reducing two beloved characters into being little more than the nagging wife trope. And before anyone tries to comment, well, it's just the Flintstones, get over it, or whatever, yeah, I realize that, but I just think it's a strange way to interpret such beloved characters.
Without completely derailing the video or anything, the character of Wilma is actually an homage to the character of Alice Cramden from The Honeymooners, an iconic American sitcom that the Flintstones is effectively an homage to. And knowing that, it almost feels like a betrayal of the character to only use her as the butt of a fist-shaking "my damn wife" gag, even if the mechanics spawned from that is halfway decent. So for the next 5 minutes, I'm gonna explain why Wilma deserved better than...
Ist das eine Jump-and-Run-Rezension oder ist das Pontifikat und zeige deine Kunststudienzeit, Nick?
Wait, what?
Anyway, the standard gameplay. We should probably get to that right about now, shouldn't we? Like I mentioned earlier, its moment-to-moment gameplay definitely feels akin to what you'd find in a Super Mario Bros. Game and is fairly solid. Adding to this is the fact that you can perform a flutter jump that's similar to Yoshi's in Yoshi's Island, and you can also attack enemies by whacking them with a club. While some of the level designs, especially later in the game, can start to grow a little frustrating due to poor enemy placement and the fact that the game perplexingly has hit stun in it, things are relatively clear-cut and easy to understand and navigate here. On top of that, while the controls themselves aren't the tightest, the game does move along at a generally quick pace. Fred and Barney move at, and I'm just estimating here, around the speed Mario and Luigi move when you're holding down the run button in their games, which lends themselves towards running face first into whatever hazards are in front of them if you aren't careful. On top of that, you can also make them run even faster by holding down either of the shoulder buttons. Doing this seriously revs them up though, so I honestly don't recommend using that ability unless you're pressed for time, which is actually a fairly big part of this game's gameplay. Each of the levels you enter has a time limit that the stage has to be completed within and exists to put a little extra pep in your step and prevent you from dilly-dallying or exploring the stage a bit too much, sorta like in a Mario game in case you haven't noticed that pattern yet. However, Treasure of Sierra Madrock goes out of its way to actually use that time limit more aggressively than any other platformer that I've played before by throwing stages your way that can be as short as 30 seconds long. These stages are honestly a pretty nice touch too, because the game's level designs can prove to be a bit on the generic side otherwise and can blend together. This also isn't helped by the fact that the stages are also usually way too short for their own good to begin with, and because a lot of the assets can end up getting recycled through each of the stages themselves.
Wow, it must be expensive to produce all these cartoons.
Well, we cut corners. Sometimes to save money, our animators will reuse the same backgrounds over and over and over again.
Although to be fair, we are talking about an adaptation of a Hanna-Barbera cartoon, so recycling assets to save time and money isn't so much a fault as it is austere, I guess.
At any rate, I really appreciated the way the developers used level time limits to keep the player on their toes during their playthrough, and I also appreciated that they threw in a couple of alternate gameplay styles to do the same thing. At the end of each world is a Mode 7 racing stage that needs to be completed before you can move on to the next level. You can trigger this stage by tracking down a character on the map that has a MacGuffin that Barney and Fred need to progress, and while the stages themselves are actually pretty easy and anticlimactic as far as boss battles go, they're pretty enjoyable and make for welcome fun. Overall, the Flintstones, the Treasure of Sierra Madrock, is a pretty fun game. As far as the gameplay goes, I definitely agree with what critics had to say about it back in the day, but I also see why it's fondly remembered by people who grew up with it. However, that's just the gameplay. As an adaptation of one of the most iconic cartoons of all time, it's also worth asking whether or not I think the game does its source material any justice. And I can honestly say that the game does just that. Treasure of Sierra Madrock is an absolute delight of a game to look at thanks to its bright and cheery color palette, its well-designed sprites, and...
No, that's it. I genuinely couldn't think of a third thing for that line.
Seriously though, I love this game's graphics and how well it represents the citizens of Bedrock. Everyone's rendered so vibrantly here, and everything's genuinely a treat to look at. While there isn't much along the lines of parallax scrolling on the main stages and the animations themselves can look a little stiff at times, things generally look pretty good and do a great job of capturing the feel of a classic cartoon.
Though much like before, I guess the lack of excessive animation and layering does bring it more in line with its source material. So I guess that's also the game just kind of being austere.
As for its music, the Flintstones, the Treasure of Sierra Madrock's soundtrack has no business being as good as it is. The soundtrack does everything you'd expect a decent licensed game's soundtrack to do. It rearranges the series' iconic theme, it works its melody into a few of its own originals, and it has a generally light and playful tone that's in line with the visuals. While a bit short and lacking in variety, I really enjoyed what this game's soundtrack had to offer. I wouldn't call it necessarily memorable or anything, but the arrangements were fun and were generally successful at elevating the excitement found in the gameplay. And the game's sound effects were pretty on point too, though I do think it was a bit of a missed opportunity that they didn't recreate some of Hanna-Barbera's iconic sound effects in 16-bit glory.
Also, one of the songs here sounds like it was straight plucked out of Cowboy Bebop's opening for some reason.
Simply put, it's got a beat and you can dance to it.
So does the Flintstones, the Treasure of the Sierra Madrock, hold up? It actually surprisingly does. While I was concerned whether or not I'd enjoy this game due to its middling reviews from back in the day, the game is actually a decent platformer with some fairly enjoyable visuals and music too. And while I'm not the biggest Flintstones fan by any stretch of the word, I did enjoy getting to explore the world of Bedrock and see a couple of familiar faces in the process.
I think this game is one of those rare instances where time has actually been relatively kind to an otherwise middle-of-the-road game. Even though Treasure of Sierra Madrock isn't the best, it really doesn't have that many glaring problems that render it unenjoyable. I certainly wouldn't go out of my way to play it, but if you're looking for a decent 2 or 3 hour long platformer to play over a weekend or something, the Flintstones, the Treasure of Sierra Madrock is a pretty good time.
Anyway, with that said and done, that brings us to the end of this video. Feel free to like, comment, or subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed it, and feel free to leave an answer to the question of the day down in the comments if you haven't already. You could also leave a recommendation for a game you'd want to see covered in a future video down there, and if you feel like supporting the channel via donation, you can do so by following the Buy Me a Coffee link in the description or down in the pinned comment. You can also follow me on Twitter and Instagram by following the links down in the description or by searching for @NichePlays on those respective sites. So yeah, Bye!